I'm CARMEN, president of the Kootenay Wildlife Heritage Fund. Recently we put together a big game symposium at the Key City Theater, and we organized 6 of the best wildlife biologists across Western North America to speak. I'd suggest that everybody take a look at the videos that we're putting together. Plus I would suggest to Premier Horgan that he get a hold of these 6 individuals and they develop a big game management program for the province of British Columbia. It would be the best thing he could do. It's not about caribou alone, it's about our entire big game populations.
The problem we see today here is that the attitude towards simple things like winter feeding, which is so important. Winter feeding is avoiding a famine for elk and deer and all of the species that we hunt. And that's so important to us. The next thing here, which is a serious problem, is predation. The wolves, cougars, and believe it or not, coyotes too, and bears. Bears are part of the mix. They are all impacting the animals that we hunt. And this has got to be reversed. If it isn't, then hunting as we have come to know it, the hunting culture that we experience, will die. And that we want to prevent at all costs.
We have a deficit in wildlife mainly because of misplaced attention in the wrong place. We hear from environmentalists that we have a deficit in habitat. We don't. We have a surfeit of habitat. We have large areas of habitat that are empty of large herbivores particularly. And what we have not been looking at or admitting to is the fact that predation plays a very, very important role in decimating wildlife populations. We have forgotten that wolves, for instance, are a predator literally out of control because of Pleistocene extinctions. What happened at the end of the Pleistocene is that the large cats and predaceous bears, which controlled wolves, disappeared, and the wolf was free. And the only factor that ever controlled wolves were human beings. If you let go of that control, they will decimate the herbivore populations very, very severely, and you get into a predator pit, which we are suffering from in British Columbia right now. Habitat, any emphasis on habitat is misplaced at the present time. We have a surfeit of it. What we have to look at very closely is how do we get a handle on controlling predators. And that is what we have to do very urgently. It's not a popular thing, but we have to do it. It's not an extermination of predators, of course not, but it is control. In order to generate biodiversity, which we need to do, we have to look very, very closely at predator management.
One of the questions that I've also been asked too is, what's the human place in nature, what humans should do on it, and how things were in the past. Unlike most wildlife ecologists, have spent an extensive amount of time deciphering the archaeological record, and I also work with all the first-person historical journals. I hate to say I have them all, but I think I have them all from Alexander Mackenzie's 1700 trip to the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the Mexican border. I analyze these in very great detail. Even though you're Canadians, you've probably heard of Lewis and Clark on that type of stuff on it. I've analyzed all the wildlife observations that they made, all the observations when they saw native people. There's 40,000 data entries, okay, numerical data entries. The only place Lewis and Clark encountered any wildlife, any bison, and especially any grizzly bears, was in buffer zones between the tribes at war. What controlled the distribution and abundance of wildlife in the Americas was native people, primarily native hunting, and native modification of the habitat. The other thing, based on the extensive archaeological evidence starting in Africa 4 or 5 million years ago, humans have completely modified everything. What you think is natural, what the Europeans saw when they first stepped off the boat, had not been created by God or nature, had been created by Aboriginal people, by modifying the habitat, primarily with fire, and actually by keeping ungulate numbers at a reasonable level so they wouldn't overgraze the habitat. And if you want a reference to this that you can pull off your bookshelf and read, it's from Australia. It's called The Greatest Estate on Earth. The Aboriginal people in Australia had 40,000 years, to remake the habitat, and they remade the habitat too. And what's interesting in that book by Gambage is the fact there's some islands off the Australian coast that have never been occupied by humans, and no one goes there because they're a living hell, okay? What people think is natural and native and beautiful that we like was all anthropogenic. Without the native people here, it would have been entirely different.
Yeah, I believe that management of wildlife must be brought back down to a more local level. After 30 years of working for the federal government, traveling around the world in a lot of different capacities and working around the U.S. and spending a lot of time in Europe, it's my firm opinion that the federal government has taken a lot of authority from the state governments and provincial governments, if you will, and the UN has taken authority on up, and Brussels has taken authority over there. And that authority is really controlled by and trying to implement the agenda of people whose ideas are very different than most rural people. They want to preserve everything and not use it. And the rural people have to live with it. They have to go about their daily business. And that has caused a great distance and a lot of problems, not only in places with all this woods and some grazing capacity for livestock, but in places that are farmed good and places near cities. And different places need different kind of attention, and the local people know what it needs. And the local people can apply it in ways that they can live with and be good citizens and have good economies. Otherwise, when they're ruled as they are now and are increasingly ruled that way, it's more like in the medieval times when the man in the castle controlled everything, and you had to live like that because he could say tomorrow, you can't kill these, you've got to live with those, you don't touch that, you got to do this. That's where it's going, and I don't think it's intentional, but that's the way rural people are suffering at the hands of this new governance, I guess, if you will, that's going on throughout the world.
Some of the issues that we've got to talk about is if I want a legacy to pass on to my granddaughter and get her involved in other children and future generations, we've got to look at mortality. We've got to look at shared management, whatever you want to call that. We've got to look at stepping to the plate and doing some things that are going to turn some of those populations around. And if we don't, there's nothing left there. And you know, I'm not against getting rid of all cougars, etc., or grizzly bears or black bears or wolves. We want them. They're part of the legacy that we want to pass on. But we've got to step up to the plate and for a period of time look at managing those populations so that we can turn some of those populations around that are at levels now where they'll never recover if that's left alone. We're managing a wild ungulates out there in the landscape. It's not cattle in a fence. So we got to look at the population dynamics. We got to look at, you know, the number of bulls, cows, and calves you got there. Those are so important. And you know, if we don't do that, you know, there's nothing left. And that's not what I'm about. And the other important thing is public education. If we step up and make the public more informed, a more informed public will get involved. If they're not, you know, we've lost it then.
Wildlife managers and wildlife management has been at the forefront of conservation on this continent, both Canada and the United States, for well over 100 years. And also the native people that were here, the indigenous people, they used wildlife and they managed the forests as well with fire. Now what we have to do is I think we should bring back coordinated planning where we get everybody to sit around the table that's got a stake in it and start working together. I don't think there's an area in the province that has a greater opportunity to bring back the wildlife abundance that we once had. Maybe not to the same numbers, but definitely we can bring them back with the crown land that we have in the Rocky Mountain Trench, with the fantastic capability of wildlife. That's why they were there. These great ranges that we have there, this great capability we have for ungulates particularly. And we also have to remember that there's a lot of people that, you know, have an upside down view about nature. I mean, they look at the individual animal, they're concerned about the individual animal. We have to start looking at the health and the welfare of the populations. Another thing too is that hunters provide a service to the public by ensuring health and safety of the public. We keep the public safe from wildlife depredations. We keep the public safe from predators by managing the predators. These are all things that we need to do. And as we become more and more urbanized, it's more and more difficult for people to understand that. And that's something we have to do. We have to win the hearts and minds of the public to get the support that we need, and particularly get the politicians on our side.